This is Garis, Masculist MGTOW flyers, that is 2 or 3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 481, part 2, entitled Biconscious Masculists will continue to attack monoconscious feminists until they become biconscious. Continuing straight on. The fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges are also indirect genociders, since they have made divorce so toxic for men that in many countries now 2/3 of young men reject marriage and paternity because they are too toxic, too dangerous for men, resulting in the fact that these men crash the birth rate. But these millions of men who reject marriage and paternity are merely reacting against the toxicity of the divorce courts. So it is the fluffy feminists who are the root cause of the crash in the birth rate, and hence are seen by the masculists as indirect genociders, and hence have to be stopped with bullets if necessary. Young men today reason that they will not risk a 1 in 4 chance of being financially crucified in a hated fluffy feminist hypocrite genocider dominated divorce court system, so decide instead to live the MGTOW lifestyle, in brackets equals men going their own way, that is, men who refuse to marry, reject paternity, and spend their money on themselves. Close brackets. Masculists talk increasingly of a sex war, since no culture that financially crucifies and destroys the lives of 1/4 of its fathers can remain intact. What is happening in the divorce courts is a war issue for the masculists, a source of real hatred and violence. There is a limit to men's patience. Men will snap, pick up arms and murder thousands of these fluffy feminist hypocrite genocider lawyers and judges who see men as cash machines to be abused and robbed. These monoconscious fluffy feminists know nothing about masculism, so remain by definition monoconscious. So by default have traditional female expectations of men, that is, seeing men as existing on this earth to pay for women to have babies. To masculists, fluffies are vermin, immoral, parasitic, manslaving vermin to be wiped out. And we masculists do that by totally ignoring fluffies, and even worse, fluffy feminists who are both parasites and hypocrites. So to you monoconscious feminists, the longer you remain monoconscious, the more we masculists will attack you for your monoconscious bigotry. We biconscious masculists, who by definition have had both our feminist and masculist consciousnesses raised, see your monoconsciousness as oppressive to men, since you don't see your decades-lasting manslavery of men as a gender crime. You see it merely as the traditional male role. The essence of masculism, however, is that it is a rebellion by men against being man-slaves to women, working for women. Masculists argue that women now have a career window of half a century, so have a powerful, in capital letters, moral obligation to get off their fat parasitic asses and flip up, or be severely punished by men by not getting one. Masculists and MGTOW ideas are now spreading widely and extensively across the planet, and millions of men are waking up to the horrors of manslavery by hated fluffy parasites who don't bother to flip up, who expect to be fluffies as adults, and have some stupid gullible manslave work for her for decades of his life. I read that now, in the UK, young men care more about the level of fitness of a potential girlfriend than they do about her looks. They are looking at these young women with a very cold eye, asking themselves, quote, Is this woman a fluffy? Is she expecting to parasite off my money for decades and then take me to the hated, fluffy, feminist-dominated divorce court system and financially crucify me, ripping me away from my kids with a 1 in 4 probability? Fuck that. Fuck fluffies. Or better still, no one fuck fluffies so that they wipe off the face of the earth, forced to fip up and stop manslaving men, a huge gender crime against men. So you, the monoconscious feminists, we masculists will give you a bit of time to convert yourselves into biconscious feminists. But if you don't, we'll bite your fucking heads off with very angry, hateful masculist diatribes. We will harangue you out of the room with masculist ideas, masculist rhetoric, masculist anger and hatred at the far greater gender crimes that you women commit against men than the relatively minor gender crimes that men commit against women. We masculists call you monoconscious feminists molehill feminists because you make mountains out of molehills with your relatively minor feminist, that is, monoconscious feminist claims that men gender politically oppress women, whereas the reality is far worse in the opposite direction. We masculists threaten you, monoconscious feminists, with real masculist hatred at what you're doing in the divorce courts, your hypocrisy regarding the legislation of the that's paternity rejection right, so that men are given the same legislated right to reject an unwanted pregnancy as women have. Most women are appalled at the idea of the even though they have the maternity rejection right, seeing men at a deep level as put on this earth to pay for women to have babies. A deeply ingrained attitude that most women have, that the masculists are crushing out of women, because masculists now refuse to be manslaves to women. Masculists put enormous moral pressure on women to fip up with slogans such as, be fip or be manless. No calculus, no baby. Rather a fip than a fluffy, etc. Masculists claim that it's in your self-interest as a monoconscious feminist to become a biconscious feminist, since a biconscious feminist is much more likely to have a boyfriend. A monoconscious feminist has learned from feminism that men oppress women, but knows nothing about the reverse direction, by definition. So she is angry at men for men's oppression of women. So she becomes rather feminazi bitchy and very unpleasant to be with for men. So men reject her. They force her to rot on the shelf. But with a biconscious feminist, she has had her feminist anger at men for the ways that men oppress women cancelled by her masculine anger at women for the ways that women oppress men. She will be a lot less feminazi bitchy and hence more approachable by men, so will be much more likely to have a boyfriend. As masculine and MGTOW ideas spread, men will become a lot more intolerant towards monoconscious feminists and label them MFBs, that's monoconscious feminazi bigots. That is, closed-minded towards the idea that women oppress men far worse than vice versa, with their decades-lasting gender crimes against men, especially their decades-lasting financial parasitism of men, living off the money and labour of a man for decades, manslaving him for decades. To masculists, manslavery is a war issue, because masculists see manslavery as slavery, and slavery as hateable, a war issue. Look at the origins of the US Civil War, which was largely about the immorality of Negro slavery in the 1800s in the US. Masculists see manslavery as a much larger problem, since there are billions, with a B, of manslaves in the world today. Masculists are out to free them this century worldwide by putting powerful moral pressure on fluffies to get off their fat parasitic asses and fip up, to create a fip society, that is, one in which young women are socialized by parents and educated by teachers to be fips or be punished by being manless, as no man will go near them, spitting at them for expecting to be manslavers. Masculists are very conscious how women oppress men, and that women oppress men far worse than vice versa. So when they hear some monoconscious feminazi lashing out at how men oppress women, these masculists react like a bull to a red flag. They get very verbally aggressive and are filled with hatred at the ignorant bigotry of the monoconscious feminist who is ignorant of the masculist case. So masculists educate her with venom. They harangue her out of the room with a very angry, hateful, masculist diatribe like the one given above. They make it painfully obvious to these MFBs that gender oppression is not a one-way street, that men are the oppressors and women are the oppressed. In reality, it's much more the other way round. These very angry, hateful masculists tell these monoconscious feminists that masculists will continue to attack them until they become biconscious, until they stop lashing out at men, behaving as molehill feminists, when in comparison, masculists talk about gender crimes against men by women that are hugely worse. For example, women's decades-lasting financial parasitism of men. Women's decades-lasting paternity fraud, in brackets, that is, in about 5% of pregnancies, the husband is not the father, close brackets. Women's pill lying, where a woman who wants to get pregnant lies to her boyfriend/husband that she's taking the pill, but isn't, gets pregnant, then forces him by law, capital letters, to pay for a kid for decades that he does not want. A major gender crime. Masculists push for the legislation of the para, so men can be freed of unwanted paternity. The fact that women have the mara, but men don't have the para, is the most blatant form of sexist discrimination that exists, that screams out for reform. The fact that so many women feel abhorred by this para idea, only makes masculists scream at them with masculist hatred for their supreme female solipsistic self-centeredness, their female selfishness and callousness towards men. As more and more men go masculist and MGTOW, and the longer feminists remain monoconscious, the more biconscious masculists will bite their fucking heads off. We masculists will continue to attack monoconscious feminists until they become biconscious. That is one of the main messages that masculists have to give to women. We masculists are fed up with hearing from monoconscious feminists that, quote, men are pigs, men are toxic, men are rapists, men are the warmongers, men are morally inferior, etc. When we masculists know that, quote, women are dumber than men, women have 10% smaller brains, women have won a pathetic 1% of science Nobel Prizes, women build nothing, invent nothing, create nothing, women are mere fuckholes, baby factories and child raisers, which is not status worthy since any woman can do that. Women oppress men far worse than vice versa, etc., etc. So when we masculists hear some monoconscious feminazi lash out at men, we can hurl back at her using masculine slogans such as the above, intellectually and emotionally crushing her, giving her a taste of her own bigoted gender political medicine, haranguing her out of the room, telling her that her days of feminist gender political monopoly that the feminists have had for nearly 6 decades are well and truly over. Men are now intellectually armed with masculinist ideas, masculinist rhetoric, that they are now using with tremendous effect. In short, if you women, you feminists, you monoconscious feminists, continue to piss on men, then we men, we masculists, we biconscious masculists, will shit on you right back, forcing you to men-fair the gender laws, to legislate the para, to reform the divorce courts, etc. Or in the limit, we won't just bitch slap you, we will use bullets, Since no culture that financially crucifies and destroys the lives of a quarter of its fathers can remain intact, there will be a sex war, and millions of monoconscious feminazis will be killed. What is happening now to the masculists, who are abolitionists, who are against manslavery across the planet, is the historical equivalent to what the abolitionists did to Negro slavery in the 19th century. To masculists, fluffydom is manslavery. Manslavery is slavery, and slavery is hated, a war issue. We masculists are at war against fluffies and fluffy feminists, aiming to wipe them out, to exterminate them, slowly, by totally ignoring them, forcing them to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless and spat at, for being man-slaving parasites, for being vermin, hated by the masculists, who aim to see them wiped off the face of the earth so that we live in a FIP society with men-fair gender laws. Otherwise, we men, we masculists, will go to war, a sex war. Today's gender status quo cannot continue. It is so bad that there is ever-growing talk in the manosphere of a sex war. Everyone needs to pay attention to this. The gender politicians need to mend fair the gender laws, or they will be assassinated. The fluffy feminist lawyers and judges in the divorce courts need to pay attention to this, or they will be murdered in their thousands. Young women need to vote with men for the men-fairing of the gender laws, the reform of the divorce courts, the legislation of the para, or young masculisted and MGTOW'd men will continue to refuse to give them their sperm due to their rejection of marriage and paternity, due to the toxicity of the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts. And ordinary monoconscious feminists need to become biconscious, or they will have their fucking heads bitten off by very angry, hateful, biconscious masculists.